Yesterday, something happened no one saw coming. A city celebrated, neon lights slicing through the fog, horns blaring, crowds pressing close, faces lifted toward the sky as if they were looking for answers in the clouds. But underneath the laughter, beneath the flashing signs and the televised smiles, something fragile was cracking. Something that would not wait for the morning. In the quiet corridors of power, Washington hummed with a tension you could almost taste. It was not anger. Not fear. Not panic. Something subtler. A pressure that pressed against bones, nerves, and conscience. A storm was forming, invisible, relentless, ready to sweep everything away if it chose. And at the eye of it all, one man stood. Not heroic. Not tragic. Not mythical. Just human. A man who had built himself from stubbornness, from the whispers of others, from the chaos no one else wanted to face. He wasn't born powerful. He was born loud. Restless. Hungry for recognition. And in his hunger, he learned the rules of survival: speak first, strike harder, never show doubt. Yet here, in this moment, even his confidence felt brittle. Every handshake, every deal, every glance at the cameras outside was measured. Every word could be a spark. Every silence could be a trap. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do if your world changed overnight? He had always believed he was untouchable. That the system could bend, twist, even break under his will. But power has its own rhythm. A rhythm he was learning to respect, or perhaps fear. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A memo misfiled. A friendly voice turned cold. A campaign promise that no one noticed had shifted slightly, imperceptibly, in wording but not in consequence. At first, it seemed harmless. Then came the silence, heavy, suffocating, like a room after everyone has left but the shadows remain. The rules were changing. And he didn't know who had the pen. The question was never who won. But who decided what winning means. Behind the speeches, the photos, the tweets, the confident smiles, the truth was waiting. It was patient. It didn't shout. It only revealed itself in moments when everyone was too busy to notice. The system did not fail. It had been designed this way. To make even the strongest doubt. To test loyalty, patience, and judgment in ways that were invisible to the public eye. Outside, freedom looked bright. The crowds cheered. The pundits debated. On television, everything seemed clear, simple, inevitable. But inside the halls of power, dependence ruled. A subtle kind of control, the kind that bends behavior without chains or bars. You can't buy freedom. You can't legislate fairness. You can only choose who you'll be when everything falls apart. And sometimes, the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between what the world expects from you and what you expect from yourself. He could feel it, the invisible weight of expectation pressing against his chest. Each decision now carried the potential to ignite a fire he could not put out. Every conversation, every glance, every handshake could tip the scale. And yet, there was no one to blame. Not really. Not entirely. The whispers in the corridors had become a chorus. Each voice offering advice, warning, judgment, a symphony of caution and accusation. Some were allies. Some were enemies. Some had never even met him. And in the end, it did not matter. The truth was simple, he had to make the call. The world would not wait for his hesitation. And then, silence spoke louder. Not the absence of sound. Not the calm after the storm. But the kind of silence that carries consequence. The kind of silence that forces reflection, fear, and clarity all at once. It is a silence that only comes when everything has been stripped away, when only the choice remains. He thought about the past, the victories he claimed, the losses he ignored, the promises he made. He remembered nights alone in offices with flickering lights, staring at plans that felt too big, too impossible, too human to execute. Every mistake he had ever made felt larger now, amplified by the weight of expectation and history. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It's passed down. One brave choice at a time. So when your moment comes, what will you stand for? What will you risk? Who will you become when the walls are closing in and the world is watching, silently, waiting for you to falter? This is the test. Not of strength. Not of fame. Not of power. But of humanity. The ability to act, to reflect, and to survive, without losing yourself entirely in the process. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it all begins again. A quiet choice. A subtle shift. A moment that feels small, insignificant even, but carries the weight of the future. And maybe, that's the night America quietly changed. The city slept, or it thought it did. But inside the Capitol, lights never truly went out. Offices hummed, elevators whispered, and somewhere, a phone rang in the dead of night. It was always the dead of night here. The hours when decisions carried more weight than applause. And he was awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the echoes of choices he hadn't made yet. He wasn't always this man. There was a time when ambition felt like a distant story, like someone else's life unfolding in the newspaper. He was a child once, restless, curious, loud enough to be noticed, stubborn enough to be feared. He learned early that the world didn't hand out respect. It only gave attention. And attention could be used. Molded. Wielded like a tool, or a weapon. The machine was already there, larger than any one person, more patient than any enemy, and silent in its operation. It moved through hallways, emails, phone calls, and the soft shuffle of papers across polished desks. It shaped lives before anyone could realize it. And he had to learn its rhythm. Or be crushed beneath it. There were moments he almost broke. Not publicly, he never showed weakness publicly. But in the privacy of his own mind, doubt crept in like a fog. The fear of failure. The fear of irrelevance. And yet, each time, he found a way to turn the fear into fuel. To transform hesitation into strategy. To speak loudly, even when the room was silent. It wasn't just power he wanted. It was proof. Proof that the rules could bend. That the system could be challenged. Proof that someone could stand against it, and survive. Because survival, he had learned, was more than staying alive. It was about leaving a mark that couldn't be erased. But survival had a cost. And Washington was the place where costs accumulated quietly, invisibly. Where favors turned into obligations. Where every handshake could hide a threat. And where even loyalty had a price. The first cracks in his armor came not from opposition, but from expectation. From allies who questioned, doubted, whispered behind closed doors. From friends who became observers, watching, measuring, waiting for a mistake. From a system that didn't care about loyalty, only compliance, performance, and spectacle. It was the tension between image and reality that would define him. What the world saw was confidence, certainty, and control. What Washington saw was calculation, hesitation, and pressure. And he had to balance both. Every speech, every tweet, every nod had to carry the weight of intention, without revealing the strain beneath. Sometimes, he wondered if anyone understood. If anyone knew how heavy it was to be both the puppet and the puppeteer. How strange it was to fight for freedom while trapped in its architecture. And yet, he kept moving. Kept smiling. Kept playing the game that had been set before him. The system was relentless. And the system was patient. It could wait years for someone to slip. It could observe silently as alliances shifted, as power moved like shadows along the walls. And it would punish, quietly, mercilessly, anyone who misjudged its tempo. He could feel it now. A pressure building in the air. A tension that made the skin crawl, that made conversations feel like traps, that made loyalty a word with a hidden meaning. He knew the city celebrated outside, but he also knew the celebrations were fragile. Like neon lights flickering in a storm. Like a heartbeat that could stop at any moment. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever felt a world closing in before you even knew it existed? He walked through the empty corridors of his office, past framed photographs, past awards, past reminders of victories long ago. He stopped at a window, looking out over the lights of the capital. The streets were empty. The city slept. And yet, the weight of expectation was heavier than ever. Because in Washington, the night never ends. It only waits for someone to make a mistake. And that's when he realized something profound. It wasn't the opposition he had to fear. It wasn't even the press, the polls, the public scrutiny. It was the system itself. The invisible, patient, inevitable system. And it had already chosen its moment. The storm was coming, and he could feel the first raindrops. Not literal rain, but the pressure, the whispers, the unavoidable choices. Every move he had made, every deal he had struck, every public word, all leading to this moment. A moment where survival would no longer be measured in applause. Where power would no longer be measured in headlines. And where humanity would finally be tested. He remembered advice once given to him, long ago. Control what you can. Accept what you cannot. And always remember who you are. But in this moment, he wondered if anyone could truly control anything. If the world was just a series of forces larger than any one man, shaping outcomes he could barely see. And yet, he had a choice. The same choice every human has in a moment that matters, act or be acted upon. And that's when everything changed. For the first time, he saw clearly not what the system wanted him to do. But what he truly wanted to do. Not the applause, the headlines, or the power. But the simple, human act of standing firm. Even if it meant the world would push back. The corridors of power had never felt quieter. Yet inside, a storm raged. Because the weight of choices, when multiplied by history, feels like thunder. And sometimes, thunder is all you can hear before the lightning strikes. The morning came slow. Not with the sunrise, not with birds, not with gentle light. It came with alarms, the buzz of messages, the quiet panic that builds before anyone admits it. Washington was awake. The city thrummed with invisible energy, power shifting, alliances forming, loyalties tested in silence. He stepped into the room, and the air felt thick. Thicker than usual. Like the walls themselves were leaning in, listening, judging. And everyone knew, something had changed. Something fundamental. At first, it looked like progress. Promises made. Handshakes secured. Headlines written. The public cheered, the pundits nodded, and the cameras flashed. But behind the optics, the rules were shifting. Quietly. Invisibly. Like water slipping through fingers, carrying the foundation away with it. The whispers had become voices. Some urgent, some cautious, all relentless. You need to act. Wait. Don't move. They're watching more closely than ever. And he heard it all, the pressure, the doubt, the expectation, wrapped around him like a tightening coil. He remembered his own words, once spoken in a braver time. I will not yield. I will not falter. I will lead. But now, those words sounded distant, echoing in a space crowded with hesitation and fear. Not his fear, the world's. And that's when the first signs appeared. Small mistakes. Missteps. Miscommunications. They were minor individually, almost laughable, yet together they formed a pattern. A warning. The storm was here. He could feel the cracks beneath the polished surface. The allies who once smiled in agreement now hesitated, their eyes darting away. The friends who had supported him openly whispered behind closed doors. Even the machine, patient, relentless, inevitable, seemed to breathe against him, testing his weight, measuring his strength. And yet, he moved forward. Because moving backward was not an option. Because even when the walls creak and threaten to fall, humans push, stumble, and sometimes rise stronger. The tension in the room became almost tangible. A weight pressing against lungs, hearts, and resolve. Every conversation was a negotiation, every glance a potential betrayal. And he understood, finally, that this wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about power. It was about survival. In the truest, most human sense. At lunch, he sat alone for a moment, staring at a plate of untouched food. Outside, the city moved, oblivious, impatient, alive. Inside, the storm continued. Every news alert, every social media post, every whispered rumor was another raindrop, building into a flood. And he was standing in the middle of it, unprotected, exposed. He thought about the people he had relied on. The advisors, the friends, the allies. He remembered the nights they spent planning, laughing, arguing. And he realized, they were all caught in the same storm. They, too, were human. Bound by loyalty, ambition, fear, and hope. And then came the moment he had been waiting for, or perhaps dreading. The first real test. A decision that demanded clarity, courage, and sacrifice. One that would reveal not just what he was willing to do, but who he truly was beneath the polished speeches and public persona. The room went quiet. The clocks ticked. And in that silence, he understood a truth most never see. Power is not what you hold. It is what the world allows you to keep. And the moment the world shifts, so does your control. The decision was simple. The implications were not. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the weight of every choice, every word, every action stretching back years, echoing into the future. Outside, the world cheered. Inside, Washington held its breath. The question was no longer hypothetical. It was no longer about potential or possibility. It was now. Here. The storm had arrived. And he would have to choose. He thought he understood the game. Every handshake. Every deal. Every televised promise. He thought he saw the rules. But he hadn't seen the machine. The machine was quiet, invisible, and patient. It didn't care about loyalty or honesty. It cared about outcomes. It cared about compliance. It cared about the story the world would remember. And now, he could see it. The threads connecting everything. Every favor owed. Every obligation recorded. Every whisper repeated in the right ear. The system didn't fail. It couldn't fail. It was built this way. He walked through the halls, familiar, yet suddenly alien. Offices where he had celebrated victories now felt like chambers of judgment. He recognized the faces, advisors, colleagues, friends. But the expressions were different. Measured. Calculating. Quietly waiting to see what he would do next. He understood, finally, that freedom on the surface was a mirror. Shiny. Bright. Reflective. But behind it, dependence ran deep. Invisible chains, subtle pressures, quiet manipulations. Every move he made had already been observed, interpreted, and leveraged. It wasn't personal. Not exactly. It was systemic. Like a river carving through rock. Slow. Relentless. Inescapable, if you didn't know how to swim. He thought back to moments he had ignored. The emails left unread. The warnings dismissed. The advice considered, then discarded. All of it had been shaping him, whether he realized it or not. And now he saw the price. Not money. Not titles. Not reputation. The price was understanding. Understanding that even the strongest could be nudged, coaxed, pressed, and tested. Until a choice became inevitable. He could feel it in the air. The subtle vibrations of tension. The quiet shuffling of papers. The faint hum of fluorescent lights. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. The storm had a name. It was expectation. It was consequence. It was history watching. It was the weight of millions who had never asked to be involved, yet were caught in the fallout. He had always believed that knowledge was power. But here, knowledge was a double-edged sword. The more he knew, the less freedom he had. The more he saw the threads, the more entangled he became. And that's when it hit him. The truth was not what he had feared. The truth was what he had ignored. What he had refused to acknowledge in the noise of ambition and certainty. The system was not the enemy. It was indifferent. It was inevitable. And it was patient enough to outlast anyone who refused to adapt. He could fight it. He could try. But the choice would not be simple. Because to resist was not just to act against the system, it was to act against the current of history itself. And in that moment, he understood the human cost. The cost of pride. The cost of stubbornness. The cost of believing that power was yours simply because you wanted it. Outside, the city moved, unaware. The headlines would not capture this. The cameras could not see it. Only he and the quiet halls knew what was coming. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do if the world was quietly pressing on your every choice? He realized something else. The storm was not here to destroy. It was here to reveal. Not weakness. Not strength. Truth. And truth, he understood, was merciless. It demanded clarity, courage, and concession. It forced reflection. It exposed the cracks in intention, judgment, and heart. He could see now that every act of defiance, every calculated move, every whispered negotiation was just another ripple in a vast, patient system. Nothing was random. Nothing was accidental. Everything was inevitable, if you knew how to read it. And in that clarity, there was power. Not the power the world applauded. Not the power that filled headlines or polls. But the quiet, terrifying power of understanding. Of seeing the system for what it truly was. And knowing that, for the first time, he could act within it, deliberately, decisively, humanly. And yet, the storm was far from over. The pressure was only growing. The choices would become sharper. The consequences more visible. And he would have to face them all. Because in Washington, the game was never about winning. It was about survival. About reading the currents beneath the surface. About knowing what to fight, and what to yield. And in that room, surrounded by walls that had witnessed history, he finally understood. The truth was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of action. And every decision from this point forward would echo louder than any headline. The room was silent. Or maybe it wasn't, maybe the silence had weight, sound you could feel pressing against your chest. Washington waited. The system waited. History waited. And he felt it all, a pulse of expectation that made the air shimmer, the walls close, the floor tilt just slightly beneath his feet. He could no longer hide behind speeches. No camera could capture this. No crowd could cheer it away. This was raw. Human. Real. He remembered the early mornings, the nights spent alone, the victories that felt hollow, the losses that felt endless. All of it led here. To this storm, this moment, this impossible clarity. The pressure had been building for months, whispers, leaks, expectations, demands. And now it exploded inward. The choices he had delayed, deferred, dodged, were no longer negotiable. They demanded him. Every instinct, every memory, every fear came rushing forward. He thought about freedom, not the abstract kind, not the headlines, not the applause. Freedom was fragile, personal, and terrifying. It was the choice to act when the world expected hesitation. The choice to stay human when the machine demanded calculation. The choice to yield when strength threatened everything else he valued. Outside, the city roared. Cheering, laughing, moving, oblivious. And inside, every heartbeat echoed like a drum, a countdown, a warning. He clenched his fists. He breathed. He remembered who he was, not the figure on TV, not the man in headlines, but the human at the center of it all. And for the first time, he felt the storm differently. Not as a threat. Not as a weight. But as a mirror. Showing him what he had become, what he had wanted, and what he could still choose to be. You can't buy freedom, he thought. You can't legislate fairness. You can only choose who you'll be when everything falls apart. The storm outside the room mirrored the storm inside. Not literal wind or rain. But chaos in whispers, memos, phone calls, and unseen eyes. And for the first time, he understood, the real power wasn't about resistance. It was about decision. And the courage to embrace the human cost. Every instinct told him to fight. To hold fast. To push back. And yet, every instinct also whispered caution. Because here, in the heart of Washington, every act had consequences unseen. Every refusal echoed in halls he would never leave. Every move mattered, and yet, it mattered differently than he had imagined. He thought about the people who counted on him, family, friends, allies, strangers. How could he act, knowing every choice rippled outward? And how could he act, knowing the machine could move without mercy? The moment stretched. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became eternity. And the room breathed with him, or maybe it was he who breathed with the world. Finally, he understood the truth of the storm. It was never about winning. It was about awakening. About realizing what mattered most when everything else fell away. He raised his hand, not to command, not to declare, but to decide. The choice was human. Fragile. Heavy. Perfectly imperfect. And then, in that silence, the storm broke. Not with applause. Not with explosions. But with the weight of understanding, the clarity of decision, the quiet force of humanity asserting itself against inevitability. And in that moment, the world tilted. Not violently. Not dramatically. But subtly. The air shifted. The pressure eased. The storm didn't vanish, storms never truly vanish, but it was no longer unyielding. And he realized, survival wasn't about defiance. It wasn't about strength. It was about choice. About taking the moment, standing firm, and accepting what comes after. Outside, the world went on. Inside, history watched. And he, human and flawed, had chosen. And then, silence spoke louder. The storm passed. Not with sirens, not with headlines, not with fireworks. It passed quietly, like a tide receding, leaving traces of what had been. He sat alone for a moment, the weight of everything settling around him like a heavy blanket. The decisions he had made, the pressures he had borne, the truths he had faced, all of it lingered. And in the silence, he realized something essential. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It isn't a headline or a speech or a deal. It is passed down, quietly, one choice at a time. Each decision a small act of courage, a whisper of integrity in a room full of expectation. He thought of the people outside. The city that had celebrated, unaware of the storm that had roared within these walls. He thought of those who had guided him, opposed him, watched him, and trusted him. All of them, human. All of them, fragile. All of them, part of the same system that had tested him, and now, in some way, taught him. There was no victory here. Not in the conventional sense. No headlines could capture the subtle shift, the quiet force of a man standing firm when the world demanded otherwise. But there was understanding. And understanding was the beginning of clarity. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city below. Neon lights glimmered, cars moved, conversations drifted up from the streets. The world continued, oblivious, unstoppable. And yet, for him, something had changed. He smiled softly, almost to himself. Not triumphantly. Not arrogantly. But with the calm acceptance of someone who has faced the storm and learned its rhythm. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever felt the weight of your own choices, quietly shaping the world around you? There were no fireworks. No applause. Only the quiet knowledge that he had acted with humanity. That he had chosen wisely, even if the world would never know. The halls were still. The lights hummed softly. And somewhere, in the spaces between shadows, he understood that this quiet act of courage, was more powerful than any headline, any victory, any applause. And he thought of the future. Not the politics, not the power, not the spectacle. But the small human moments that matter most. The whispered words of trust, the subtle gestures of integrity, the choices that honor what it means to be human. Freedom is fragile. But it is real. And it lives in moments like this, small, quiet, human. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it all begins again. A choice. A moment. A whisper. And in that whisper, he found peace. The days that followed were quieter, yet heavier. The cameras moved on. The crowds dispersed. But the halls of power remembered. Every whisper, every glance, every small gesture that had unfolded during the storm lingered, like smoke in a room that had been burned but not destroyed. He walked through the corridors, the polished floors reflecting the soft overhead light. He saw familiar faces, some relieved, some wary, some still calculating. And he realized, the system doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. It watches. It waits. Each step was a reminder that choices echo far beyond the moment. That one decision can ripple, unseen, altering outcomes for people who may never know why. Power, he understood, is less about force than consequence. Less about winning than responsibility. And in that quiet understanding, he felt a strange weight, and a strange liberation. He thought about the headlines he had once chased. The applause he had once craved. The deals, the promises, the moments he thought mattered most. And he realized that they were fleeting, insubstantial, shadows on the wall compared to the weight of human consequence. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a small shift. A recognition that integrity, however fragile, mattered more than optics. That courage, however quiet, was the truest form of power. And that the real victory lay not in dominating the moment, but in surviving it fully human. Outside, the city carried on. Traffic hummed, neon lights flickered, the world marched forward, oblivious to the storm that had roared inside these walls. Yet, even in oblivion, the world was changing, slowly, subtly, imperceptibly. Because every human choice leaves a mark, even if it's invisible. He remembered the people who had counted on him. The allies, the skeptics, the observers. All of them now part of a story that would never appear in print. And he felt a quiet responsibility to them, not to control them, not to manipulate, but simply to act rightly, even when no one watched. Hit subscribe and tell me, if you had the chance to act without anyone noticing, what would you choose? There were still challenges. The storm was not gone. It never fully goes away. Pressure, expectation, scrutiny, they are constants. But he had learned to move within them. To breathe, to reflect, to act with humanity despite the currents that threatened to pull him under. And in this calm, he found something unexpected. Hope. Not the kind painted on billboards or shouted in speeches. But the quiet, resilient kind that exists in small decisions, whispered choices, and human courage. The kind that survives storms, systems, and time itself. He leaned against the window, watching the neon reflections ripple across the city streets. He saw movement, life, the ordinary chaos of millions of people making choices, struggling, thriving, surviving. And he realized that he, too, was just one human among many. Navigating the tides, learning the rhythm of the storm, finding light where he could. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Not triumph. Not applause. Not recognition. Just enough to continue. To act. To live. To endure. Because survival is not about glory. It is about humanity. And humanity, fragile though it may be, is resilient. And so he stood, quietly, human and flawed. Watching the world move forward, knowing he had chosen wisely. And that, in the end, the choices we make, even the quiet ones, define who we are. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The city never waits. Neither does the press. The world outside Washington moves at a pace that ignores storms, ignores silence, ignores the quiet choices that ripple beneath the surface. He stepped into the office, and the phones were already buzzing. Messages, alerts, leaks, updates, the digital pulse of a city that demanded answers before it even knew the questions. Every ping, every vibration was a reminder, the storm had not left. It had simply shifted. Reports arrived like missiles. Questions framed to provoke, to test, to unsettle. He read them carefully, line by line, understanding not just the content but the intention. Every paragraph, every headline was a mirror, showing not reality, but expectation. And expectation, he knew, was far heavier than reality itself. Outside, the cameras waited. The crowds waited. The world waited. And inside, the corridors hummed with invisible tension. He thought about the public, millions of eyes, millions of opinions, millions of silent judgments. They believed in certainty, in control, in clear victories. They wanted simplicity. And Washington rarely offers simplicity. The whispers in the halls had returned, sharper now. Allies, skeptics, friends, strangers, each had their own view of what should be done, how it should be done, who should lead. Every suggestion carried weight. Every recommendation carried consequence. And every silence, his own or theirs, was filled with meaning. He felt it in his chest, the subtle tightening of responsibility. The invisible grip of scrutiny. The awareness that every move, every word, every gesture would be measured, analyzed, judged. And yet, in the midst of the pressure, he found clarity. Not in headlines. Not in applause. Not in tweets. But in the recognition that every choice he made could either propagate chaos or offer quiet stability. And that recognition, heavy though it was also liberating. Hit subscribe and tell me, how do you act when everyone expects you to fail? The media framed narratives, some accurate, some distorted, all relentless. Voices rose, questions repeated, stories morphed. The world outside demanded action. The system inside demanded calculation. And he had to navigate both, humanly, deliberately, and without losing himself. He recalled the storm, the quiet, invisible force he had faced days ago. It hadn't vanished. It had transformed. And now it came not as a singular wave, but as a tide of expectation, pressure, and history pushing from every angle. He closed his eyes briefly. Breathed. Remembered why he had started. Why he had fought. Why he had chosen to step into this storm in the first place. It wasn't for applause. It wasn't for headlines. It was for the small acts of humanity, the choices that mattered, the moments unseen by the world but felt deeply by those around him. And as he opened his eyes, he understood, the test was not over. The storm would never truly end. But he could meet it. He could act. He could endure. Because this tension, this pressure, this relentless expectation, was the measure of humanity in power. Not the victories, not the losses, not the spectacle. But the quiet, deliberate choice to remain human amidst it all. And so he stood, center of a room full of whispers. Aware of the world watching. Ready to act again. Knowing that in every moment of pressure, there was opportunity, to define, to survive, to choose. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The corridors of power felt colder than usual. Not the temperature, but the tone. Allies moved quietly, cautiously, as if every step might betray them. Friends smiled, but their eyes measured. Even loyalty seemed hesitant now, weighted with calculation. He could feel it, subtle, nearly invisible, yet undeniable. The alliances he had relied on were shifting. Not with dramatic betrayal, not with overt hostility. But with quiet hesitation, small delays, half-answers, and careful glances. The storm outside had found its way inside. Every conversation was a test. Every handshake, a negotiation. Every nod, a question. And he realized that survival wasn't about winning debates, securing headlines, or asserting dominance. It was about reading the currents beneath the surface. Understanding the invisible forces shaping every outcome. The phone buzzed again. Messages stacked like dominoes, each one carrying expectation, pressure, or threat. Some were urgent. Some were subtle. All of them mattered. All of them demanded attention. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever felt the subtle weight of everyone watching, waiting? He paused, leaning back in the chair. He thought of the past, victories celebrated, alliances forged, promises made. And he realized, everything was conditional. Everything. No loyalty was absolute. No trust unbroken. Everything depended on timing, perception, and the human willingness to act when it mattered. He remembered a warning, long ago. Power is patient. Power is subtle. And power always tests the human heart. And the test was here. Not a single moment, not a headline, not a speech. But a series of tiny, relentless pressures, each one demanding clarity, courage, and honesty. He could see the patterns now. The whispers, the half-truths, the careful movements of friends and rivals alike. They were not enemies. Not really. They were human. And humanity, when combined with pressure, produces complexity, doubt, and hesitation. The media had picked up the scent. Headlines framed events in stark terms, victories and failures, triumphs and mistakes, heroism and scandal. But they could not capture the subtle, invisible currents that defined the real story. Only he could feel it. Only he could navigate it. And so he moved carefully. Step by step. Word by word. Gesture by gesture. He negotiated not just deals, but trust. Not just outcomes, but alignment. And always, always, he measured the human cost. Because he knew, even a small misstep here could ripple outward, unseen, and reshape everything. Loyalty was fragile. Alliances were delicate. And the storm was patient. He remembered what he had learned in the first quiet moments of reflection. Freedom isn't given. It's chosen. And every choice carries weight, visible and invisible, immediate and distant. He had chosen before. And he would choose again. Not with spectacle. Not with applause. But with human clarity, deliberate thought, and the courage to face consequences. The room felt charged. Silent but alive. The kind of silence that carries meaning louder than words. Every presence, every glance, every breath was part of the unspoken calculus of survival. And in that charged stillness, he understood something profound. Power is not about winning alone. It's about navigating the intricate human network, respecting it, understanding it, and acting within it. Because in the absence of understanding, even the strongest collapse. He stood slowly. Adjusted his tie. Took a breath. And prepared to step back into the storm. Because the storm didn't wait. It didn't forgive. It didn't pause. It only tested, relentlessly, those willing to face it. And he would face it. Human, flawed, resolute. And maybe, that's how resilience begins. The pressure didn't wait. It arrived in the form of calls, emails, and subtle demands that seemed polite but carried teeth. Each message was a test, each request a mirror reflecting the cracks he had felt growing for weeks. Allies hesitated. Some avoided meetings. Some spoke carefully, measuring every syllable, every gesture, every word. It was not rebellion. Not yet. It was something quieter, far more dangerous, doubt. And doubt spreads faster than any headline. It infects rooms, conversations, alliances. It transforms loyalty into hesitation, trust into calculation, friendship into strategy. And he could feel it creeping into every corner of his world. He thought back to the decisions he had made, the choices that seemed small at the time but were now magnified under pressure. Each one a ripple. Each one a stone tossed into still water. And now, the waves were reaching the edges of everything he had built. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever realized too late that small choices shape everything? The media smelled it. They framed it as chaos, scandal, unpredictability. And while the headlines screamed, the real story played out quietly, invisibly. The system itself was testing him, patience versus impulse, strategy versus humanity, control versus consequence. He walked through the halls, each step measured. Every glance from an aide or advisor carried meaning. Every closed door whispered possibility. And in every silence, he heard the unspoken question. Who can we trust? Who will act when the pressure breaks? And who will crumble? It wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about clarity. About human judgment in a room that refused to wait. About knowing when to push, when to yield, and when to simply observe. The cracks he had sensed before were no longer theoretical. They were real. Visible in hesitation, in avoided eye contact, in the careful phrasing of every sentence. And he understood, survival here required not just courage, but perception, patience, and timing. Outside, the city roared. The world demanded answers. And he felt the weight of expectation pressing down, inescapable, relentless, like gravity he could not fight. He stopped at the window. Looked down at the streets below. Neon lights flickered. Cars moved. People lived. And none of them knew the choices being made above, the storm being navigated, the fragile alliances hanging by threads. He remembered a lesson long ago. Chaos is not defeated with force. It is navigated with understanding. And understanding, he realized, was now his only tool. To act rashly would fracture trust irreparably. To hesitate would invite collapse. But to move deliberately, humanly, with awareness, that was power. He closed his eyes and breathed. Felt the tension, the stakes, the human cost. And he made a quiet decision. Not for applause. Not for headlines. Not even for power. But for clarity. For humanity. For the fragile network of people whose lives were entangled with his choices. Because in the heart of the storm, it is not dominance that saves you. It is discernment. It is courage. It is the act of standing fully human when the world expects something less. The halls of Washington held their breath. Time seemed suspended. And he moved forward, ready to meet the consequences of fractured alliances, broken trust, and the relentless machine. Because that is what it means to endure. To act wisely. To remain human. And maybe, that's how decisions survive storms. The first ripple hit quietly. A small leak. A conversation misread. A hesitation that turned into suspicion. Nothing catastrophic, not yet. But enough to signal change. Allies no longer moved in sync. Meetings were cautious. Emails carefully worded. Every gesture scrutinized. Even friends seemed to measure loyalty, like coins weighed in a scale, uncertain of their value. He noticed it immediately. The slight pause before agreement. The micro-expression that hinted at doubt. The silence that followed a statement that once would have been met with nods. And he realized, this is what the storm leaves behind. Not the crash of thunder. Not the headlines screaming victory or defeat. But hesitation. Mistrust. The quiet erosion of certainty. The pressure mounted. Not from one source, not even from the public. But from everywhere at once, the system, the machine, the media, the city, the invisible expectations pressing like a tide that refuses to recede. He walked the halls with measured steps. Every interaction required calculation, awareness, patience. Because in Washington, the smallest lapse can ripple into the largest catastrophe. Every pause, every word, every glance carried weight. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever felt the world shift in ways no one else can see? The headlines, meanwhile, screamed narratives of chaos. But the real story was invisible, subtle, delicate, human. It lived in gestures, glances, and the invisible threads of loyalty stretched thin. The public would never know. The media would never capture it. But he felt it. He lived it. And with each passing hour, the consequences became clearer. Small fractures widened. Small disagreements grew. And alliances that seemed unbreakable trembled under the pressure. He remembered the first lessons. Power is patient. The system waits. The storm doesn't attack, it reveals. And now, it revealed the truth of the human condition. Fragile trust. Unseen tensions. The quiet unraveling of certainty. He stopped in the middle of the office, breathing deeply. Measured. Aware of every heartbeat in the room, every silent judgment, every unspoken question. Because here, every choice mattered. Every word mattered. Every hesitation mattered. And he had to act. Not out of ego. Not out of pride. Not for headlines. But for clarity. For humanity. For the fragile network of people whose lives were tangled with his own. Outside, the city continued. Cars hummed, conversations drifted, neon lights flickered. But inside, the storm pressed closer. And for the first time, he saw how deeply human actions, small, deliberate, subtle, could change the outcome of everything. The machine tested him still. Allies wavered. The world watched. And he moved forward, fully aware, fully human. Ready to meet the consequences of a storm that never truly ends. And maybe, that is where resilience begins. The room was tense. Not with noise. Not with shouting. But with anticipation, like a wire stretched to its limit. Every breath, every glance, every subtle movement carried consequence. He had watched the fractures widen. The hesitation. The quiet distrust. The invisible cracks that had begun weeks ago and now threatened to break the fragile network around him. And now, the moment had arrived. A confrontation that could not be postponed. A choice that could no longer be delayed. The storm demanded action, not reflection, not hesitation, not analysis. He entered the room with measured steps. All eyes followed, some with expectation, some with doubt, some with subtle calculation. The air shifted. Even the lights seemed to flicker as if holding their breath. Hit subscribe and tell me, how do you face a moment where hesitation could cost everything? The conversation began cautiously. Words chosen carefully. Gestures measured. But tension is a language of its own. Every pause, every inflection, every silence spoke volumes. He could feel it, the weight of every decision, every expectation, every unspoken fear. It pressed down, relentless, a tide that threatened to pull everything under. One ally stepped forward, voice steady but edged with subtle warning. Another countered, careful, measured, testing limits. And he realized, this was the human heart of power. Not headlines. Not speeches. Not the spectacle the world demands. But the quiet negotiation of trust, loyalty, and consequence. He spoke. Not to dominate. Not to command. Not to appease. But to act with clarity, humanity, and awareness. The room shifted. Some nodded. Some resisted. Some hesitated. And in that moment, he understood the paradox of power. Strength is not always shown by force. Sometimes it is shown by deliberate choice. Sometimes it is shown by courage under pressure. And the consequences were immediate. Small victories. Small concessions. Small fractures healed, or at least stabilized. But the storm was not gone. It had only revealed the truth: the world does not wait. Allies are human. Trust is fragile. And every choice echoes far beyond the moment. He leaned back, eyes steady, breathing slow. Every instinct told him to relax, to savor the small stabilization. But he knew better. The storm never sleeps. The machine never rests. And the pressure would return, stronger, sharper, unrelenting. Yet in that moment, he felt something rare. Clarity. The understanding that even in chaos, even amidst doubt and hesitation, deliberate human action could shape outcomes. That resilience is born not of certainty, but of presence. Of awareness. Of choosing humanity in moments when everything else urges compromise. And he understood the true lesson. You can face the storm. You can navigate the machine. You can endure the fractures. But only if you act, fully, humanly, and without delay. The world outside roared. The headlines would not capture this quiet victory. But he felt it. He lived it. And he moved forward, prepared for whatever came next. Because storms are endless. But clarity is powerful. And maybe, that's enough to keep moving. The echo of yesterday's confrontation lingered. Not in voices, not in headlines, not in the world's eyes. But in subtle shifts, a hesitation here, a glance there, a conversation carefully measured. Every choice had consequences. Every action left a ripple. He could feel it. In meetings, in hallways, in the quiet corners where no one noticed. Allies tested boundaries. Rivals exploited hesitation. Even the most loyal faces carried questions now, not spoken, but written in the lines of their expressions. The system moved. Always moving. Unforgiving, unrelenting. And he understood that the storm was not just outside. It lived within the people, the walls, the very air he breathed. He reviewed the reports, watched the reactions, measured the conversations. Small fractures had grown. Small cracks widened. And even the tiniest miscalculation could send them spiraling into chaos. Hit subscribe and tell me, when every choice ripples, how do you know which path to take? One decision from yesterday had shifted alliances in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. A statement made with precision now seemed provocative to some, conciliatory to others. The ripple effect traveled farther than he imagined. And he realized, control was an illusion. Influence existed only in awareness, in timing, in human perception. Outside, the cameras captured noise. The press framed narratives of confusion, of unpredictability, of what happens next. But reality, the invisible, human reality, was far more subtle. It was in the tension behind closed doors. It was in the micro-gestures that revealed trust or doubt. It was in choices that would never appear in print. He walked the halls, breathing slowly, observing everything. Every pause, every silence, every glance told him something. He could sense the fractures growing, the hesitation spreading, the alliances bending under unseen weight. And he understood, his job was no longer to dominate the storm, but to navigate it. The stakes were higher now. Not political. Not public. Human. Every decision carried impact on lives, on relationships, on trust. And the pressure was personal. Every heartbeat reminded him that survival, influence, and integrity demanded constant attention. He stopped, closed his eyes, and recalled the storm, the silence, the tension, the clarity he had found in decisive moments. That clarity was a compass. A fragile one. But without it, he would be adrift, swallowed by uncertainty, by expectation, by human fragility. And he understood something profound. The storm outside, the headlines, the pressure, the world watching, was relentless. But the storm inside, the network of human relationships, trust, and loyalty, was the real test. And navigating it required more courage, patience, and awareness than any public victory. He breathed again. Measured. Focused. Knowing that every choice now had a ripple, and every ripple could alter outcomes beyond his sight. And he had to meet it. Humanly. Fully. Deliberately. Because survival, he realized, is not about force. It's about understanding. It's about timing. It's about human judgment in a world that rarely sees it. And in that quiet awareness, he moved forward. Step by step, choice by choice, ripple by ripple. And maybe, just maybe, that's how resilience survives storms. The cracks he had sensed before were no longer hidden. They had widened. They had grown. And now they demanded attention. The emails, the messages, the whispered conversations, all converged into a singular reality: action was required. Not hesitation. Not delay. Not calculation. Action. Decisive. Human. Immediate. He walked through the office, the air thick with expectation. Eyes followed him, some hopeful, some wary, some silently questioning every step. The weight of their trust pressed on him. The weight of their doubt pressed harder. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do when every choice has consequences you cannot see? The storm had returned, not as a roar, but as a tide of scrutiny, expectation, and consequence. He felt it in every glance, every gesture, every small sound that echoed in the halls. Even the walls seemed aware. Even the air seemed heavier. One decision could stabilize alliances. Another could fracture them irreparably. Every word, every pause, every expression was amplified. And the world outside, oblivious, demanded clarity, demanded action, demanded results. He recalled the lessons of the storm. Strength is not always loud. Power is not always visible. Survival is measured in awareness, in timing, in human judgment. He gathered the allies still aligned. Voices were careful, words precise. No one acted recklessly. No one assumed certainty. Every conversation, every suggestion, every nod was calibrated. Because now, the stakes were unmistakable. The first consequences appeared immediately. Some responded favorably. Some resisted. Some simply watched, measuring, calculating, waiting for the next move. And he realized, in this environment, patience was as valuable as courage. Outside, the cameras framed chaos. The media painted uncertainty. The world assumed missteps were inevitable. But he knew the truth: the real narrative was invisible. It lived in human choice. In deliberate action. In trust built, trust maintained, trust broken and rebuilt. He felt the tension rise in his chest. Every heartbeat a drum reminding him of stakes beyond headlines. Beyond speeches. Beyond applause. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever felt the world pressing on every choice you make? He moved with calm purpose. Measured. Deliberate. Human. Every step, every gesture, every word chosen with awareness. And with that awareness came clarity. A recognition that the storm outside could not dictate the storm inside. That human judgment, patience, and courage were the only tools that mattered. The pressure intensified. Allies wavered. Rivals pressed. Every small misstep could ripple into disaster. But he faced it fully. Fully aware. Fully human. Fully deliberate. Because in the end, the storm does not end. It only tests. It only reveals. It only measures those willing to act, to endure, and to choose humanity amidst chaos. And in that understanding, he found power. Quiet. Fragile. Human. But enough to face the inevitable. And maybe, just maybe, that's how decisions survive the storm. The first results were subtle. Not headlines. Not applause. But in the quiet shifts of behavior, the small nods, the gestures that had meaning only to those who understood the stakes. Allies moved with more certainty. Some opponents paused, reconsidering. The ripples of his choices began to show. He watched carefully. Measured reactions. Observed patterns. The storm had not vanished. It lingered, always waiting, always patient. But within it, small threads of stability had emerged. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever seen change quietly unfold, almost invisible to the world? Decisions made under pressure revealed the character of people around him. Who could be trusted? Who acted out of fear? Who followed principle? And in that observation, he found clarity. Not the clarity of victory. But the clarity of understanding. Small victories built quietly. Allies aligned more deliberately. Doubts softened. Tensions eased, just slightly. Enough to allow focus, enough to breathe, enough to see the path forward. He remembered the moments of hesitation, the fractures, the storm that seemed unending. And he realized, the pressure had not broken him. It had taught him. It had forced him to measure human character. To act decisively. To endure fully human, fully aware, fully deliberate. The city below carried on, oblivious. Traffic moved, lights flickered, conversations drifted upward from the streets. The world assumed normalcy, unaware of the subtle victories, the human choices, the moral clarity that had emerged from chaos. He leaned back, eyes softening. Breathed in the quiet of a moment that felt earned, not given. He understood that the real story was never written in headlines. It was written in the decisions, the choices, the human courage displayed when the storm demanded more than spectacle. Hit subscribe and tell me, when the stakes are invisible, how do you measure success? Even as consequences unfolded, he knew the storm would return. But within him, something had shifted. Not the world. Not the machine. But his understanding. His ability to act. His patience. His humanity. And in that shift, he found hope. Not loud. Not public. But quiet. Persistent. Human. The kind of hope that survives storms, scrutiny, and time. He rose slowly, moving through the corridors, watching, listening, acting. Fully aware of the stakes, fully aware of the world's indifference, fully aware of the human cost. And he moved forward, knowing clarity had been achieved, trust cautiously restored, and the fragile threads of alliance now visible, now tangible. The storm remained. The machine continued its relentless pressure. But he had chosen. And that choice, deliberate and human, had begun to shape the world quietly, invisibly, irrevocably. And maybe, that's how the truth survives storms. The world outside had grown louder. Headlines screamed. Voices demanded answers. The pressure that had once whispered now roared, relentless, insistent. He felt it immediately. The storm was no longer subtle. It had arrived in full force. And the choices he had made, deliberate, human, courageous, were being tested. Allies who had aligned began to hesitate again. Some looked to him for guidance. Some questioned. Some retreated into caution. The delicate balance of trust and action now strained under relentless scrutiny. The machine of Washington churned. Every move calculated, every response analyzed, every silence interpreted. And he realized, the storm doesn't attack with clarity. It attacks with uncertainty. With doubt. With the quiet pressure of expectation. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do when every action is magnified, every choice questioned? He walked the halls, observing, listening, calculating, not for headlines, not for spectacle, but for understanding. Understanding of human behavior, of alliances, of consequences. Every small gesture mattered now. Every word carried weight. And the consequences of his earlier decisions began to manifest. A policy shifted. A negotiation strained. An ally wavered in a way that demanded attention. The ripples had grown into waves, and he had to navigate them without breaking. He paused by the window, staring down at the city. Neon lights shimmered. Traffic hummed. Life went on. And none of it reflected the storm raging inside these walls. The pressure was relentless. And yet, he had learned something vital. The storm is not about power. It is about perception. About human judgment. About navigating a world that tests your limits, constantly, invisibly. He could feel fatigue, the subtle erosion of certainty in others and himself. But he also felt clarity, deep and human, like a compass pointing through chaos. And he knew he had to act, decisively, morally, fully human. The meeting stretched late into the night. Voices rose. Arguments formed. Tensions boiled. And yet, beneath the noise, the quiet choices, deliberate and grounded, began to hold sway. One by one, fractures began to stabilize. Trust, cautiously rebuilt. Alliances, tentatively reaffirmed. The storm tested them all. But in human awareness, courage, and deliberate action, he found resilience. Hit subscribe and tell me, when the pressure is unrelenting, how do you choose your next move? And in the quiet moments, alone, he realized. The storm is endless. The machine never sleeps. And yet, clarity, patience, and humanity can endure. Because storms do not break all who act deliberately. They reveal. They test. They demand presence. And he, human, flawed, aware, stood ready. To act again. To endure. To face consequences, unseen and unforgiving. And maybe, just maybe, that's how power survives storms. The tension had become palpable. Not in headlines. Not in speeches. But in every glance, every pause, every measured word. The storm outside had merged with the storm inside. Allies, once steady, now hesitated. Rivals, once restrained, now pressed. And the machine, relentless, patient, invisible, tested every limit. Every action. Every choice. Every human impulse. He felt it in his chest. A pressure that no headline could capture. A weight that no applause could ease. And yet, in that pressure, he found clarity. Because storms do not break those who see them for what they are. They reveal. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do when the world watches, waits, and expects your failure? Decisions made weeks ago now came to life. Consequences that had seemed distant now demanded confrontation. Trusts were tested. Alliances wavered. And the invisible currents of human judgment pressed with unstoppable force. He walked through the halls, each step deliberate, each word measured. The storm was no longer an abstract threat. It was immediate, visible, undeniable. And every choice he made now carried weight far beyond the moment. The first cracks had already formed. Small, nearly invisible, but undeniable. A misstep could cascade. A hesitation could fracture alliances irreparably. And he understood, this was the ultimate test. Not of power. Not of fame. Not of victory. But of humanity. He paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of every life affected by these choices. The pressure was relentless. The stakes were immense. And yet he had learned something vital: clarity emerges not from force, but from deliberate, human choice. Outside, the city roared with oblivion. The press framed chaos. The world assumed spectacle. But the truth, the fragile, human truth, existed only in these halls, these moments, these choices. Hit subscribe and tell me, when every moment counts, how do you decide what matters most? Voices rose in meetings. Arguments flared. Tension spiked. And he navigated them with precision, patience, and courage. Because the storm demanded more than reaction. It demanded understanding. It demanded endurance. It demanded humanity. And slowly, as he acted deliberately, as he spoke carefully, as he observed every human response, something shifted. Not the storm. Not the machine. But the network of people around him. Trust, cautiously restored. Alliances, tentatively stabilized. The storm, though relentless, no longer dictated everything. He felt the echo of his choices reverberate. Not as headlines. Not as applause. But as human consequence. And in that echo, he realized the ultimate truth. Resilience is born in storms. In clarity. In deliberate, human action. In courage when the world expects compromise. And maybe, that's how survival becomes meaning. The storm had passed, at least outwardly. The halls were quieter. The voices softer. The tension lingered, like smoke after a fire. But the consequences were clear. They could not be ignored. He walked through the office, observing. Allies aligned, cautious but steady. Rivals tempered, measured, aware. Trust, fragile, human trust, had survived. For now. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever felt the quiet after a storm, when the world expects normal, but nothing is the same? The choices he had made, deliberate and human, had rippled outward. Some positive. Some costly. Some irreversible. And yet, in every outcome, he found clarity. Not victory. Not applause. But understanding. Understanding of human fragility. Of loyalty. Of consequence. Outside, the city carried on, unaware. Cars moved. People walked. Neon lights hummed. Life went forward. And yet, inside these walls, a subtle transformation had taken place. He paused, letting the weight of the week settle. Breathing slowly, he reflected on what had been gained and what had been lost. Some fractures remained. Some doubts lingered. But clarity, human clarity, had emerged from the storm. Hit subscribe and tell me, what do you hold on to when everything else shifts? He realized the truth he had carried quietly through every choice. Strength is measured not in applause or headlines. It is measured in understanding. In patience. In courage. In deliberate, human action when the world expects compromise. Allies approached, offering cautious support. Some tentative words of agreement. Some subtle nods of trust. And he understood, the work was not over. It would never truly be over. But for now, the storm had revealed what mattered. He looked out the window, neon lights reflecting in his eyes. The city alive, oblivious, relentless. And he smiled faintly. Because in the quiet aftermath, in the human choices made under pressure, he had survived. Not perfectly. Not unscathed. But fully human. And that, he knew, was enough for now. Enough to endure. Enough to hope. Enough to act again when the storm inevitably returned. Because life, like power, moves forward. And clarity, humanity, and deliberate choice are what carry it. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the quiet victories endure. The city below pulsed with life. Lights flickered. Cars hummed. Voices carried through the night. And yet, inside, the halls were quiet. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. He reflected on everything that had come before. Every choice. Every hesitation. Every consequence. And he realized, power is not just action. It is awareness. It is understanding. It is the courage to act humanly, even when the world demands otherwise. Allies and rivals alike had revealed their true colors. Some faithful, some cautious, some flawed. And he understood, judgment is not always public. Sometimes it is quiet, invisible, felt in the subtle echoes of human behavior. Hit subscribe and tell me, have you ever realized that the truth isn't what everyone sees, but what you live through? He thought of the storm, the pressure, the scrutiny, the relentless tide of expectation. It had tested him in every way. It had revealed the depth of trust and the fragility of alliances. It had exposed human character in stark relief. And through it, he had learned the essential lesson. Humanity, clarity, and deliberate choice are the only tools that endure. He walked slowly to the window, gazing out at the city. It didn't know what had happened here. It wouldn't notice. But that didn't matter. Because the work done in silence, under pressure, with awareness, is the work that defines reality. Every heartbeat in the room echoed the quiet truth. The storm outside measures your courage. The storm inside measures your humanity. And only by facing both can you truly endure. He felt it then, the weight of responsibility, tempered by clarity. The fragility of alliances, balanced by deliberate action. The invisible currents of trust and consequence, held steady by human choice. Hit subscribe and tell me, when everything is tested, what do you hold on to? He realized the storms will always return. The machine will always turn. The pressures, the fractures, the human tests, all inevitable. But clarity, courage, and deliberate action are tools that survive. They endure where force fails. They endure where spectacle misleads. They endure where headlines forget. And in that quiet understanding, he found something rare, hope. Not loud. Not public. But persistent, subtle, human. The kind of hope that moves quietly, yet carries everything forward. He turned from the window, shoulders squared, eyes steady. The storm would come again. The machine would continue. And the world would continue its roar. But he, fully human, fully aware, fully deliberate, would remain. Enduring. Acting. Choosing. And maybe, just maybe, that's how truth survives storms. The storm had passed. Or at least, its roar had faded. The halls were quiet now. But the lessons remained, etched in every shadow, every glance, every heartbeat. He walked slowly, deliberately, aware of the world outside that moved without pause. The city hummed, alive and unaware. Neon lights reflecting the rhythm of life that never stops. Even as choices ripple silently beneath the surface. Hit subscribe and tell me, when the world moves on, what do you carry forward? He thought of the weeks behind him. The fractures. The pressure. The tests of loyalty, trust, and human judgment. Every moment had left its mark, some visible, some invisible. All shaping the man, the decisions, the consequences. The alliances he had fought to stabilize were delicate, yet enduring. The trust he had nurtured was tentative, yet alive. And in the quiet aftermath, he understood something profound. Power is not always in headlines. Authority is not always in command. And victory is not always visible. It is human courage. Measured. Deliberate. Visible in choices made when no one is watching. It is clarity amidst chaos. Resilience amidst storms. And humanity, in the face of relentless pressure. He stood by the window one last time. The city flickered below. Life moved on, indifferent to his decisions. But the human truths remained, alive in the quiet currents of the world he had navigated. And he whispered to himself, softly, as if passing a secret to anyone willing to listen. Freedom isn't guaranteed. Trust isn't permanent. And clarity is always earned. But when the storm comes, you choose who you'll be. The halls were empty. The neon lights hummed outside. And he understood, finally, that survival, integrity, and human courage are not gifts of circumstance. They are forged. Deliberate. Persistent.
Hit subscribe and tell me, when your moment comes, how will you choose? And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The storm would return. The world would continue. But he had endured. Fully human. Fully aware. Fully deliberate. And in that quiet endurance, truth survives.